Welcome, everyone. Again, this is our webinar about an ecology of equity by April D. Simone from Designing the We. And I am Rachel Sangers, and I am the chair of the Baltimore-Rotterdam City Committee. And I want to give you all you attendees, a big welcome today. We have people in the audience from architecture schools in Baltimore and in Rotterdam, and other attendees from both our regions, the Baltimore region and the Rotterdam region. And we have visitors from around the world. So welcome to all of you, and a special welcome to the students from Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning and the Rotterdam Academy of Architecture and Urban Design. So in today's webinar, we will first have some introductory remarks from me, and then Cristina Murphy from Morgan State University, and then April D. Simone will talk for about 40 minutes or so. After that, there will be a discussion with our panelists, and we will respond to questions from the audience. And Jeremiah Ikoja, graduate architecture student at Morgan State, will moderate the Q&A, and thank you so much for that, Jeremiah. Our panelists today will include Thijs from Spaandonk, who is the Dean of Urban Design at the Rotterdam Academy of Architecture and Urban Design, and Dr. Roberto Rocco, Associate Professor of Spatial Planning and Strategy at the Section of Spatial Planning and Strategy at the Delft University of Technology in the Department of Urbanism, very long title. And we will also have Coleman Jordan, architecture faculty from Morgan State University. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you about the Baltimore-Rotterdam Sister Cities connection. Baltimore in the United States, close to DC, and Rotterdam in the Netherlands have both been sister cities since about 1985. The sister city relationship is managed by the Baltimore-Rotterdam Sister City Committee, located in Baltimore, and we are all volunteers. We also have some volunteers in the Netherlands that help us with our activities. Many of our current projects have an environmental sustainability theme. Also, many of them have an architecture and urban planning theme. And now I will hand over the microphone and my screen share to Cristina Murphy from the Morgan State University. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for opening this lecture. Hello, everyone, and welcome to An Ecology of Equity by April De Simone. This lecture is occurring within a very exciting continuing collaboration with Baltimore-Rotterdam Committee and Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning in Baltimore. On the wave of this relationship, MSU in Baltimore created a teamwork with the Rotterdam Academy, the Rotterdamse Academie van Bouwkunst in Rotterdam. We started our collaboration in 2019, in the spring of 2019, via a design studio around social justice and urban equity, the city and the citizens living within it, called the Just City Studio. Since then, we have been entertaining a recurrent spring studio involving virtual and physical interactions. And although this pandemic has stopped us from traveling, the exciting relationship still holds tight. An important factor to the success of this exchange has been the information share between the two groups. Between the spring and the fall of 2019, we launched two symposia. For both, April De Simone played a huge role in informing our students and the general audience on the large topic of just spaces in the US. April does a lot of thinking within the US context, yet her knowledge is universal, and I have no doubt that this will be a matter around the round table among Thijs, Rocco, and Coleman this afternoon. And who is April? Well, formally, April is the co-founder designing the We, a for-purpose research and transformative design firm engaging in community-driven social, cultural, and economic development in 2015. Yet, she asked me not to be formal and leave the achievement on paper. On the other side, she asked me to talk to you about what matters. And I'm sure that after this lecture, you will understand and you will share my enthusiasm in introducing her to you this evening. To my eyes, April is an urban explorer. She's a person that never stops asking questions and looking for solutions. Her intelligence is dynamic, sensitive, and humble. And she's firmly convinced that no design will work and serve context nor people if it's not done through a multidisciplinary collaboration. Designed for equity means to provide honest spaces to the citizens, cities where the citizens feel entitled to any public space. In a nutshell, how do we design the right to all, for all citizens to the city? This afternoon or evening lecture for a better grand finale is an incredible event. In this coming hour, you will hear about many injustices, hence the importance of our profession as a fair process leading to a built environment that is fair in its attempt to include all citizens. Now, for some housekeeping, panelists, you're invited to start a conversation on the topic after April has started, as presented her work and stated her case. Participants, you are all invited to ask questions. Please do so by placing your questions into the Q&A option window located at the bottom of the screen. They will be answered accordingly to the order of placement. Also, you're welcome to use the chat window, but please be aware that the panelists might not see those questions. At this point, please turn off your video and audio, including myself, with the exception of April. April, we are looking really forward to hear your energy and get involved. Please take the floor and inspire us.
Thank you so much, Cristina. I really appreciate such a warm and lovely introduction. Rachel and the entire Sister Rotterdam Baltimore community for being here and partaking in this conversation. I always start my presentations with, let me just clear this off, sorry. I always start my presentations by sharing a picture of what Cristina says is the important stuff. It's my community. It's where I grew up. And oftentimes, because the built environment has a keen way of erasure, that these images, of course, don't represent the Bronx anymore, but it's still found in cities across this country. And it embedded in me at a very, very young age to understand the dynamics between our lived experiences and how architecture the architecture embodies a spatialized inequity. And that what are the ways we begin to unpack and sort of do this forensic investigation that curates from a past to present experience to understand how we arrive at conditions as what you see in front of you on your screen. What is the decision-making process? Who is responsible? And what is the trauma-induced environments that are created as a result? And of course, even though we see this, I myself growing up in this community didn't have really at a very young age a cognitive connection that my identity for the rest of my life would be subscribed to where I grew up, who I was around, and who influenced me, and both in good ways and of course in bad ways. Meaning the minute I stepped out of my comfort of my community, the realization that your zip code does reinforce an ideology or a cognitive perception around human value, around that if I'm questioned in my ability to navigate through architecture, planning, and history because of my identity, because of where I come from. And it is an unfortunate reality that we often don't like to tussle and grapple with. But it's in that very tussling and grappling that we will then create and cultivate what I believe we all purport to want to see within the built environment, which is an ecology of equity. As I mentioned, doing this work very, very early on really created a space to want to understand the dynamism between perceptions and mental models, relationships and connections and power dynamics that inform policies, practices, and investments, and how the interplay of these three dynamics really create opportunities to interrogate how inequity becomes spatialized within the built environment. Oftentimes, we're not aware of how public systems directly correlate with cultural systems and food systems. But in the end, if we just take a quick glance at our screen, do a little bit of research, we know that we are in a tremendously inequitable space in our built environment, where those who historically have been challenged and impacted continue generation after generation, asking for, again, this ecology of equity to be invited into and play. We know that systems and the interplay of these three dynamics directly correlate with what we call the social determinants or the determinants of health. How do they impact the way the built environment is created? Economic stability, social and community context, education, health, and food. And how are we accessing these systems? That when it's done inequitably, how does it have a direct correlation to even our health and our impact? It became important to begin to understand that we don't currently have the pedagogy nor the methodology that really carves space at a table for this type of complexity. Most of the times we start with a project, we activate a project and a community engagement to check, but we don't take the time to understand the anthropological lens that has us arriving at the situation that we're seeing ourselves in now of why we have the disparities and the inequities within the built environment that we see. For us, first and foremost, it starts with people and the ability to empathize, understand, and heal. We are in very segregated spaces where often this narrative of how things have actually happened are never afforded an opportunity to reframe. And from reframing and building empathy and trust and connectivity, how does it create design processes that allow for ideation and prototyping that really embed in the heart of what we're doing concepts like equity, sustainability, and inclusion? And what are the opportunities when we co-author these design trajectories? How does it create reinvestment opportunities that, again, are vetted along those lines that allow for an ecology of equity to be invested in, to be cultivated, and to be nurtured? Of course, knowing sort of the interplay of perceptions and power dynamics and policies, practices, and investments, it was always surprising to me to come to tables where most people who are in positions of power, of manipulating real outcomes in the built environment that have very, very significant human impact, never even understood a lot of what redlining meant. And not just redlining in the US context of where we created these maps, but redlining in the mind. How do we contain and clear things that we are not comfortable with? How do we erase? How do we do the things that, again, perpetuate these dynamics of a hierarchy of human value within the built environment? It inspired, this thinking was inspired by people like Dr. Mindy Fullilove in her book Root Shop, and Kenneth Jackson, author of Crabgrass Frontier, where he unearthed these redlining maps. And what we did was we launched in 2015, Designing a We, a manifesto in action that really wanted to set the table and invite all different community stakeholders to come in to begin dialogue, to understand why we are where we are today. One of the notable pieces of the exhibition is a 16-foot timeline. It curates an understanding of how we have arrived again to a separate and unequal when we are in 2021, and possibly there's a fourth board here. But it shows how in the top macro systems interconnect, how they're rebranded, and what are we doing as a grassroots effort to push back from the bottom, and how the cries for human rights and civil rights still find their way through each generation in trying to create contextualization of, but my parent, but my grandparent, but my great-grandparent have been through systems that have really maximized this concept of dehumanization. In the exhibition, it was important to lay down concepts of what inequity meant, particularly in the American context, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, the shift from the agrarian economy to the industrial economy, and how the rapid density of cities emerged as a result of the Industrial Revolutions, as well as the environmental impact of these of this trajectory. And we also cover sort of how the rise in this space, and even though we fought a war here in this country, the Civil War, where people spilled their blood, and we created civil rights legislations in 1866 and 1877, what we did see was that despite that, how the system continued to rebrand itself, again, in this concept of this mental redlining. People like Charles Davenport import this mentality, mental model of what was called scientific racism and eugenics. It was basically, as a chicken breeder, how do you breed out what is undesirable? And as you can see on the lower left-hand corner, this propaganda really gained traction in America, so much so that it promoted the 1924 Anti-Immigration Act. And it made supremacy and an ideology of supremacy paramount to subscribe to an identity of a social construct of race, of whiteness. It also created a mental model of who, again, is worthy. At this time, as you can see in the drawing on the lower left-hand corner, that people of ethnicities or cultures of Irish, Italian, Jewish, at this point in American history are not even considered white, but are also subhumanized. And that assimilation into the social construct of whiteness only begins to happen for them after World War II. We have people like Madison Grant, who is a celebrated conservationist, a mentor to a future president, Teddy Roosevelt, rising up and writing books about the passing of the great race. So profound and influential was his writing that Hitler himself sent him a thank you letter for the power of understanding and unleashing what he did for the genocide of World War II. And we see how this propaganda and this mental redlining model shows up in places like Baltimore, where a Black family moves in to a predominantly white neighborhood and is challenged by a Mr. Dyschel, who lobbies Mayor Mahul to create a racial residential ordinance in 1910. And the irony is that Dyschel creates this propaganda. His home no longer exists. He gets to dispel to areas that are more comforting to what reinforces, again, his supremacy. And now his housing site, of which he created such a stir for, has the stigmatization that he implanted on it, and now is a site of a public housing complex. And we know that as this propaganda of mental redlining continues to happen in America, we see it infiltrate into the academic and system, into the universities, where people like Homer Hoyt, who you see here, write in the dissertation, 100 years of land value as a student, where he lists what will impact land values and what is considered detrimental to land values, which he then emphasizes are, as you can see, the most deplorable, Negroes and Mexicans. He also creates zoning, as we see that zoning, or his sector theory, that reinforces stratification of low income, middle income, high income, luxury, where toxic things will go. And it again creates this concept and paradigm within the built environment of who is accessing ecologies of equity and who is experiencing spatialized inequity. People like Homer Hoyt then become chief economists for the Federal Housing Administration in America under the New Deal. The New Deal is celebrated as a tremendous social safety net program, but part of the New Deal is to stop the hemorrhaging of the 1929 crash. And in order to do so, they create bailouts for the banks and the mortgage companies to really stop the foreclosure crises that are happening in the 1930s. And one of their platforms was the Homeowners Loan Corporation. There's scholarly debate around how much those maps that I shared with you, 239 of them were used by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. But as I argue as a scholar, the mentality and the ideology of supremacy was embedded, as you can see in question C. If race wasn't a factor, why are you listing Negro and Puerto Ricans as detrimental infiltrations to land and to community? Why are you using language of infiltration as if we were not people and human beings of this country? And the federal government takes it one step further. Again, they didn't start racism. Racism existed on this continent since the first boats landed. What they did was they codified it and institutionalized it. And those who were put in positions of authority to steward the ideologies and principles of democracy are now bringing in their own sociological theory as occupational ideology and inflicting enormous harm that transforms the geographical footprint of America. And we are still dealing with today the hyper-segregation of the ability of people to move out of cities because cities were pariah and move into the suburbs and practice racial covenants, racial segregation, because people of difference were not allowed to move into those places. And even when people were allowed to move in the late 1950s, early 60s, even though racial covenants may have been declared unconstitutional in 1948, but it was unconstitutional to enforce in court. So what becomes an enforcer is unprecedented and an unleashing of violence in this country, where people who tried to integrate neighborhoods, homes are burned down, they're attacked. And today, again, we still, with our identity, navigate where we can go into, what spaces we feel safe in, because it's all over our news. What happens when you navigate with your identity in areas that for far too long have been segregated to understanding difference and diversity? This is profitable at this time, and it continues to be. That it wasn't just about not allowing people to buy homes, but it was every aspect of the machine that begins to move, that it really perpetuates a belief that either you're not capable, able, or considered to be a human being within this ecology of equity. And of course, the history of these countries leads us to urban decay and the crackdown, so that when we have the uprisings and people are tired, similar to what we're seeing today, history repeating itself. We know that that instead of saying to someone, how did we get here? We come down with the broken windows, stop and frisk, to then tame and control environments that are so suffering from enormous trauma-induced environments. And we have people that reinvent how they're going to hand down that hammer on law and order. We see Lee Atwater, who was a strategist for Reagan, saying that we can't say certain things anymore, but all we will do is cut programs and increase and cut taxes, and we'll make sure that each of these neighborhoods become humanly uninhabitable. And create propagandas of welfare queens and people mooching off of the system. And on the heels of the uprisings, many of these communities suffer from the heroin epidemic that is not considered a public health crisis, but criminalized. The HIV/AIDS epidemic, which my father succumbs to, the crack epidemic, the violence, and now COVID in our communities. And what does this all mean as investment returns into once disenfranchised communities? We are now in the 21st century of the second redlining. And what's happening is through economics, because of the racial wealth gap that exists as a result of the property, passing the property wealth that people were able to buy at a certain point because of New Deal policies that essentially create the American middle class. Investment is pricing out people who for generations have been on the front lines of these communities, and complete erasure is occurring of what has happened and what has been the lived experience within these spaces. What does this all mean as it translates down into a local immersion into a space? I'm always fascinated, and a lot of the work that we do in the process of navigating, again, through architecture, planning, and history, I love working with communities with Sanborn maps and showing sort of what neighborhood ecologies were there before these stigmatizations or these false narratives come into play about you are in your predicament because you choose to be. My family came here with $100. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. When we begin to understand and unpack what has happened, it really does create a very different opportunity of a conversation at the table. Places like the East Tremont community, low density at the point of the 1800s, a lot of Dutch still present, come in. John Bronx is what the Bronx is named after. And you see we have transportation corridors. We have, again, ecologies developing. Industrialization rapidly densifies neighborhoods like the East Tremont community. And as you can see, I'm highlighting a marker, and it shows sort of transition over time. 1800s, there was a brook running through the East 178th Street. Now we have magnificent density. And we have different housing typologies. We have beautiful abilities to interact in the local ecology of integration and socialization, movie theaters. We had vaudeville theaters. The architecture is absolutely breathtaking. This is a Tremont, the Metro North stop, which is a more expensive line of transportation in New York. We have banks that lend locally, and again, the architecture. We have vibrant corridors. This is where the first Bronx City Hall is housed when the Bronx becomes a borough. We have a major transportation line here. So what it shows is, again, from this respective lens of the social determinants of health, an ecosystem of home, an ecology of equity, that there were accessible components or outputs in the built environment that really create this vibrancy and this connectivity to space that met the needs of many of the residents within the Tremont area. And of course, in the 1930s, we know that redlining happens, that's building off of an existing momentum, but it's saying that these areas are going to be destined for decline, that no investment should come into them. As people are bleeding out and leaving, we see that opportunities for people like my mom begin to open up, where they're trying to move from the overcrowded spaces of Harlem and get access to this concept of the ecology of equity and the American dream, and buys a home. But unfortunately, people like my mom didn't qualify for the 15 to 30-year mortgage because of the color of her skin and her identity. Instead, she was given a predatorial mortgage where she had to buy on contract. Contract buy is anything happens to the home, you don't really own it, but you have to pay for it. And you have balloon mortgages. So it was a practice of a predatorial practice that if people missed a payment, no matter how much they had paid on a home, it would be stripped for them and passed to someone else. When my mother purchases the home in the Tremont section of the Bronx, this is again the ecology that she buys into. But shortly after she moves in the early 1960s, late 1950s, we see the rapid deterioration of community because the infusion of urban renewal and quote unquote slum clearance. This is a picture of the Cross Bronx Expressway ripping through, as Jane Jacobs speaks about, entire communities and ecosystems. When shortly the Bronx begins to burn, and all those X's are all the homes around my mother's home, and that caught on fire. And we know the stories that insurance companies, landlords were burning to collect insurance money, and vandal. But we noticed that there was a correlation, as it was covered in the Decade of Fire documentary, that when insurance payments stopped, so did the fires. So for almost a decade, the entire borough burned and people profited from that demise. That train line that ran from the tip of Manhattan to the tip of the northern portion of the Bronx begins to also be subjected to policies like planned shrinkage that want to do something called benign neglect in communities to deteriorate it so much that they don't have to spend the money there and spend it only in healthy areas. We can never replace this 3rd Avenue L line in the Bronx. It's just too expensive. But it cut off a major transportation corridor for people who weren't able to leave the community, like my mom, to get to and from work. So before you know it, again, our communities looked like this. This is what we actually lived in. And we begin to almost normalize the everyday occurrence of fires, of what's happening to the built environment, to the architecture, to the structure. That movie theater that served as a social context becomes a garbage dump site. That bank no longer exists where anywhere else it would be historically preserved. That train station no longer exists, torn down. All of this architectural footprint anywhere else again would be respected and embraced. And that vibrant corridor of Tremont Avenue of shopping is all cinder blocked. And that is the home that I grew up in, because unfortunately we couldn't leave. And the fires, of course, impacted all of us. And before you know it, there's just massive deterioration in the built environment. This grounds the work that we do. It sets the tone as we do this across the country, and why it becomes important to lay this context, to understand how, again, inequity becomes spatialized, how the architecture adopts a language and a narrative of othering and of dehumanization. And it inspires work that we did with organizations like the Mary Mitchell Center in the Bronx, where we worked with youth from the Tremont community, 14 to 21, to re-envision their built environment. And it was so amazing to hear how they connected with this history that is not taught in school, that is not spoken of in the built environment through oral history, that has completely been erased. And it gave them a bigger appreciation, but most importantly, is that they said, it took a weight off of my shoulder, because the narrative infuses that it's our fault, that the situation is the way it is. And spending time and learning soft skills around design and writing surveys and doing participatory action research really inspired this concept of how do we retrofit equity to the last tenement building remaining on a block that was completely burned down. And what was beautiful is that we didn't tell the narrative, they did. They owned it. They stood up in front of community stakeholders. They stood up in front of congressional members and senators and explained what's the significance of this process and how it applied to the project, and how re-envisioning this building would create opportunities in their terms of what they spoke about, economic opportunity through cooperative ventures, and a space, an intergenerational healing space. This building sits catty-corner to where a young man, Khalif Browder, grew up, who was put in solitary confinement for 3 years, and when he was released, committed suicide. This impacts, there are many Khalif Browders in this neighborhood, and that reality, all of these young adults saw themselves as possibly it could be them. And we needed intentional spaces for this to unpack. Unfortunately, with this project, the person who was spearheading it for the organization passed away, and the building, because we couldn't close the gap of $100,000 or $200,000 after raising so much money, was demolished. The good news is that the process inspired so much within these students that a few of them ended up going to planning or design school. And now we're reactivating it, maybe on this site, maybe on another site, but it shows the significance of connecting personally as a passion to wanting to see an ecology of equity within the built environment. And when we do these projects, it helps us understand what are the macro systems that we're trying to change. What are the macro systems that have created systemic challenges of speculative real estate, hyper-segregated communities? How it correlates with the built environment and the social and the determinants of health, and how through system outputs, it shows up today again through dilapidated housing, abandoned lots, cost-burdened households. And then how, when we do a reframing, redesigning, and reinvesting process, how it yields opportunities or projects that can be traced back down to a root of how we're actually creating systemic change. I'm going to stop here. I greatly appreciate sharing this with you, and I do look forward to your questions and, again, creating an ecology of equity.
Thank you very much, April, for this. Now, I am looking forward to the panelists. Panelists, can you please turn on your camera and your mic, please? Attendees, you are all welcome to ask questions. Clearly, you can place your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. And well, I leave the mic to you. Roberto, Thijs, Coleman. Maybe
So
I can start. Oh, sorry.
No, go on, please.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks. It's really mind-blowing, April, to listen to you speak. Thank you so much for your account. I was not familiar with a lot of the details that you revealed, and I'm really mind-blown. I have a burning question, really, and I think we are all practicing architecture and urban planning in this context of erosion of democratic norms, right? I think democracy is crumbling, and I think the election of Biden is just a respite. We are still struggling. But you said something super interesting, because in this context, we need students and practitioners to really be hands-on and to know the communities they are planning for, and to understand what's going on. I come from Brazil, where I have to say hyper-segregation is the rule, right? It's very similar to South Africa in that sense, I would say, more than to the United States. And in my country, people like me who went to university have very, very, very little knowledge of what's going on in these areas that are hyper-segregated. I'm interested, what's going on in the United States? Do you think education in the United States is a little bit more maybe successful in engaging students and letting them see what's going on?
Thank you, Roberto, for your feedback and your poignant question. It's only in this moment, and Coleman, and I'm going to butcher your name, Thijs? Is it? I mess up big time. That's the big joke. It took me a while to say Walter. You all can add in, but I think that because of what has happened, particularly with all the police brutality and the deaths and the marching, people are not just depending on academic spaces, which still remain in the dark. I think people are creating what Ella Baker called study circles and conversations and connecting outside of academia, and that connection then finds itself back into academia, ironically, because people then begin bringing this up and challenging. I heard this. How come we're not learning about this? I can't tell you how many students come, and no one has ever taught me redlining, and I'm like in my final year in architecture school. So I think that we're in a unique moment for the very exact reasons that you said. I do this because it's reparations to democracy. I believe in democracy. And if we don't have a humanity uprising, which is at the core of democracy, we won't do that if we don't have this knowledge and we don't have this intentionality to bring it into practice. But we are hanging on a thread in America with so much violence every single day. Because of this deep embedded history that no one wants to kind of ride the bull on.
I was going to make a comment earlier, and thanks for that response as well. And also, Roberto, thank you for your question, your inquiry. So you talked about a personal context, and you're growing up in your neighborhood. So I'm going to talk about my personal experience in my neighborhood, because I just did an alumni talk at my high school, literally a couple of days ago. So I don't know if you're familiar with Shaker Heights and the Ludlow community. All right, so I grew up in the Ludlow community. I'm a product of that community, and those of you that are not familiar with it, it was a community in the 60s that said that when during white flight, that said, and this is specifically the Ludlow community, not all of Shaker, but it said, we're not going to run, we're not going anywhere. We're going to have a dialogue with the community that comes in here of difference. So we were one of the first families in Shaker, Black families in Shaker, to into that Ludlow community. And so there are a handful of us coming into that neighborhood. My father happened to be a realtor and was able to, he's sort of a jack of all, but did realty. And I know a couple of Black families that were actually realtors that were able to move in there because they had some insight into the housing stock. So one of my experiences there, and it's still, sort of controversial today, but at the same time, economically, Cleveland opened up their borders slightly in that community to allow lower income. So we had students from low income, literally that lived in projects. We had classmates that had basketball courts in their house. That's how wealthy, Shaker is one of these wealthy neighborhoods in Ohio. And so you had a cross section. We were a lower middle class, our family, which had a cross section of communities. And so we all races, we had, had students from, our classmates from all over the world, literally, in that community. And, it was supposed to be this sort of mecca of change. And it did. It affected me quite a bit in life. But I'm just wondering if you, when I think about what actually happened, it was the white community that said, we're not going to go. So they're the ones that are in the power structure. I think often that sort of mirror of looking into how do you, in other words, if they're not seeing us as them, they're not seeing us as equal, then it's not going to happen. So these terms like diversity get thrown around in the U.S. and we think everything is okay, but it hasn't been dealt with. Diversity just means everybody except minorities, the domestic minorities often. And so I'm just wondering, I guess, in your research, have you looked at communities that have not had white flight, not had that redlining happen, where they sort of forced it to not happen?
Shaker Heights was one of them. Coleman, I know that we had discussed it before, and I think if I remember correctly, there was a documentary made around Shaker Heights, and just sort of unpacking the different experience. I have to say, and we've traveled so much with this exhibition, that Shaker Heights is a rare example because it's an anomaly. The communities did not, even Mount Vernon, where you can try to make a case for it, you begin to notice the disinvestment in the schools, the parks, and other aspects. I have not come across many that have really said and made the statement, we're going to stay. That's why I think Shaker Heights is so celebrated, because it is a rarity. I can't think of the other one in Baltimore. Age is catching up to me. That they also did a big study on, because that was also the intent for many of the residents there. Do you remember that one? I'm sorry. I will share it in an email. I really, so it's in Maryland. It's similar.
Is it Columbia? Are you thinking about Columbia, maybe?
No.
Maryland? Okay.
No, it's a name of an actual development site or development community. But when the pressures of land value begin to drop, as much as they wanted to stay, they were enticed to leave. And you can argue that too in the Bronx, right? When I grew up in the Bronx, in all honesty, my neighborhood that with all the dilapidated and the fires happened was completely segregated. Everyone had left there. But when we moved to Little Italy in the Bronx, a couple blocks away, in my high school years, there was still diversity there where none exists today. All of the families that I grew up with and played basketball with, they all left the community. So I think this concept I can't believe some of the stuff that comes out of their mouth on Facebook. I think that it's structural racism or supremacy along racial, class, or gender lines is becoming even more pronounced because of an economic factor, pricing people out of the ability, even if they want to integrate. And I always laugh in Princeton. You have all these placards of Black Lives Matter, but not many Black lives can live there because it's so expensive.
And by the way, Shaker is not a perfect community by any means. It was just an experiment that passed, and the residue has actually changed over time.
Yeah.
It was great for a while.
Yes, April, thank you so much for your lecture. It was super interesting to hear. a lot of people always say like, yes, US is different from the Netherlands, so we can't really compare. But I think that actually there's a lot to learn from the US, and I think maybe Roberto and Cristina also haven't been working in the Netherlands or working in the Netherlands. Can agree that I think we still have this thought that we actually are like an example in urbanism, but I think what we did some pretty good real estate development maybe, but we forgot to do a lot about people, and now you really start seeing the cracks, and actually that a lot of people have been left out, and that these the principles that are, I think, behind redlining and so on actually also apply to the Dutch context, and that we still really have to get used to the fact that it's actually like we're still a bit indifferent to it, and we really should overcome that indifference. And what really for me was a not so much a wake-up call, but a very strong point was Indy Johar. He's also an architect, but he's an advisor to, I think, the London mayor, and he said the real estate, or the having real estate is it's a monopoly of it's a monopoly to the access of public or civic assets, basically. So if you see real estate and real estate ownership in that way, then it becomes completely clear that it's a very important thing to address. And what for me is kind of the key question: is it possible to disconnect, talking about urban development or community development? Can we disconnect it from real estate development? We make real estate development so important for everything we do in the city, and the value that is apparently being created with real estate development so everything is becoming dependent on that real estate development and the value of the land, basically. Can we disconnect those two?
It's become inextricably linked. And it's not just now, right? It's the same thing of what, I mean, the massive suburbanization of America was a real estate tactic, right? It was the ability to put people to work, but then allow people to buy homes. And now those home values that someone bought for close to nothing, someone who's in that same predicament of when that person first bought it cannot buy it because it's 500% more than what it was, and because of speculation and because of equity. And I think that we also have to understand that design isn't just putting these beautiful renderings or sketches, right? And I know you all know that, but that it's a multi-prong or multifaceted approach that's happening at the same time in projects. So there's a project we're working on in Trenton that same concept of land acquisition is a real threat. They're the Bronx of the 1980s and 90s with massive vacancies. So is Baltimore. And for 3 years, we've been trying to create something called a real estate investment trust. It's the same thing the real estate companies use, but it's now starting to emerge. And I'm happy to see this. You had a few examples where you had social impact investors or the ability to activate the crowd to come in and take land off of a speculative market and preserve its affordability. And it's not just preserving affordability, you're preserving an identity, a cultural presence of who can actually afford to live in the place. The one that I'm most familiar with is the Iroquois Valley farmland model, where they do it specifically for farmland. They create a trust, they buy the farmland, but they have a back-end program that trains young farmers, don't know what the definition or qualifier is for young, around regenerative and organic practices. And then they connect them to the land that gets purchased. So it's a form of sharecropping, an old model, right? Sharecropping, but we're not abusing the farmer that's renting it. That farmer gets plugged into a distribution network to make money so that they can sustain themselves. And they sign a restriction They can never sell it for profit. They can never develop on it. It's always going to be used for regenerative or organic farming. And after a certain period of time, once the farmer is able to do so, he's offered or she's offered the ability to buy the land through an internal financial mechanism. So this is the type of innovation that we're going to need. And I think, again, we're in a good moment because particularly in places like New York, you know, with all the rent regulations that have been passed, we don't know how long they'll stay, but it is a good time because people who thought they could just flip apartments now are knowing it's going to be a harder road. And places like Baltimore, I love Baltimore. It's an amazing place with so much opportunity. How do you transform these spaces so that it doesn't recreate redlining again?
We have a few questions from the audience. Can we address them to April and the panelists?
Yeah, I can start reading them off. The first question is from a student. It says, can organizations like ASLA, NOMA, and AIA do more to focus on these issues? If so, how would you all like for them to do so?
Well, I don't know if you're going to address that at all, but I do think that there is some assistance in it. So I think it does help as far as these organizations. But my own experience, and again, April, I don't want to take the platform away in that sense as far as my response, but my experience with many of these organizations, not NOMA so much, but many of the others like the AIA, and I do really think, I was in a conference a few years back where Sharon Sutton, architect who's retired now, but used to, I think she was the chair or the dean out in Seattle, in Washington University. But I was at a conference once where she did this exercise, and it was at a dean's conference, and I happened to be invited. I was in grad school at the time. And one of the questions that she had for all of the panelists there were to, in other words, take scenarios of minorities and women coming in and talk about how you would actually respond to these questions. But one thing I noticed with that exercise at that point in time was the arrogance of the deans, because they were not minorities, the majority of them, but it was the arrogance of their response, and that they were still in control of the situation. They never questioned that their position could be flipped. In other words, they could be sitting on the other side of that question. So they were always in power. And I think that with these organizations as well, with the AIA, but then also I think just the scholastics of in architecture in general, I think we really have to question the sort of nuanced sort of context of understanding that if they're not seeing us as we're looking at them and speaking to them, but they don't see value in us, then I think it starts to be quite detrimental. And then for organizations, in other words, I don't think things are going to change. But with NOMA, I think NOMA is in a different type of situation. NOMA is the National Organization for Minority Architects. And with that organization, I think there's the issue of power structure is always difficult, but at the same time, I think they're in a position to just say, we have to empower ourselves. We have to take the reins ourselves, because it's not going to come any other way. So I think in some ways they have to, in other words, just empower themselves, take over, take charge, take the reins for what is important to them, and have others follow. And I always qualify that by looking at like in music and jazz and hip hop. You can go to Japan and I can hear hip hop there. So I think in some ways, once we sort of take the reins, maybe others will follow in that sense as far as interest. But that's all. That's what I would say about the organizations at this point.
Okay. Would you like to add on to it, April?
I can. I want to invite my other panelists if they have any reflections, but I think what Coleman is speaking of that hits on point is this authorship. And I'm writing a piece now about how from the inscription moment, the moment of inscription or commission, to the actual deliverable, how much inequity shows up in those spaces. And I was inspired doing research around historic buildings of who gets to sign their name on the document, right? Who gets identified cognitively as only capable and competent of creating this, but actually who was the enslaved labor that actually built it. And what are we going to look back 100 years from now and ask, what is the message that then emboldens people to say, you're not capable, you're not competent, because the commission process of the arrogance of architecture reinforces this supremacy. Again, whether it's through the social constructs of race, gender, class, it really is going to take an outcry from practitioners to say, remember that speech that Whitney M. Young gave you in 1968 about the AIA and other respective organizations? Let's read that again, and let's figure out why it keeps showing up in what people like to call post-racial America. It's very problematic because the mental model, I can just go off into my world and be completely disconnected to the realities of what my design's impact is going to be, particularly in communities that have historically been sidelined.
Thijs or Roberto, would you like to add on to it?
Oh, Roberto, yeah, your sound is up.
No, I was just going to say I'm not familiar with the organizations that were mentioned, so I cannot comment, sorry.
Could you talk about how architectural organizations of architects in the Netherlands or in other countries, have you seen any good examples of how they've helped address these issues?
Well, I wanted to pick up on something that Thijs said, and that's related to this issue. So the Netherlands, as you know, was a welfare state until quite recently, I would say. So the level of welfare here is quite high compared to other places, and people live well. But what the Netherlands, as Thijs has mentioned, and I completely agree, has failed, is to involve people, and especially people who are different from the average Dutch person, in city making. So if you come to the Netherlands, you will see the cities here, they look very Dutch. There is no other way to explain it. They look very, very Dutch, but the society itself is very diverse. So I don't see people's culture reflected in the city very much. And I think that's a bit related to what Thijs was saying, that, it's a lot of very good development, but on the other hand, the cracks in the wall are showing right now. And that has to do, I think, with the other role of architects and planners, that is to build, to help build citizens. So citizens help make the city, and they participate in the city, and they co-design the city. And maybe here in the Netherlands, Thijs, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is what's wanting here.
Yeah, I can add a bit to that, Roberto. I think you're very right, and I think also the urban development the urbanism that was done in the last, let's say, in the post-war period. So from the post-war reconstruction and so on. The urbanism was always very part of a social democrat government, especially the bigger cities had a strong social democratic tradition, and also like a government that, top down, obviously, but thought what was good for its citizen and also acted on it. So in terms of like social housing, I think over 50% of all the housing in Amsterdam is social housing. I think that counts for the other bigger cities. Also in terms of public services and so on and so on. And that's something that, but that's also very much grounded in the Dutch, well, if you could call it Dutch culture, but it's very, I understand what you're saying, Roberto. It's very Dutch, and it's also very top-down planned. So it is like this, and that's how it is, but there's no, well, as Richard Sennett would call it, open, it's not open. So you cannot, also, and now we have to deal with this thing about participation. So it's like, ooh, it's very tricky. How can we involve citizens? Ooh, maybe we can ask their opinion, but we're very scared that actually they will have an opinion. So, so we have a lot of difficulties with actually opening up the process of city making to the citizen, and also actually making them not participate, but making them co-owner of this process. So who's in charge there? And we come from a tradition that the government's still in charge, but they also have to accept that they're maybe not so much in charge anymore and at some points. And what I want to say in respect to the question of the architectural organizations, it's very difficult to say anything about it in the Netherlands since it's super scattered. So that we have the BNA, which used to be the kind of the union for architects, but now actually it's still the same abbreviation, but it's the employers organization now. So it's a lobby group. So instead of a union, it's a lobby group. So it's it kind of shifted. So yeah, they're and since the architecture profession is so much connected to this real estate development, so we're part of the system that is problematic in a way, and so we can only thrive because we need to add more real estate to the market. That's the only way we can make money, and that's problematic, I think. So.
But do you think that also the citizens, because of the top-down situation, are they accept this? So they accept that the government takes care of them, or they even expect it, contrary from the United States, of course, Homestead and going for it, right?
Yeah, I think the social contract here is very different, right? And the role that is assigned to the state is very different here, and also the perception. I'm always, if you allow me, I'm always quite surprised when I hear my American friends talking about the government, even when they are liberals, they are very anti-government. And I think that's not the ethos here. The government is there to take care of you, right? At least in theory, but look, neoliberalism is something that's happening worldwide, right? It's a movement. It's a wave, and it's also reached Europe very much. So Cristina knows because she took part in this activity that I organized, in which we really tried to understand, okay, what are the different conceptions of the role of the state in different places, right? And I'm saying this because I think there is still the need for coordination. I mean, we cannot defeat climate change only by not eating meat. We need a lot of coordination, and I don't know where that coordination is coming from.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna go to the next question. It's for April. It says, April, you talked about important buildings that played a part in the community being demolished, which in other areas might have been preserved or heritage. In my opinion, heritage represents stories, values, and feelings. Do you feel that by demolishing these buildings, they were also trying to erase your story? And is there still heritage around the Bronx that does tell the story of the community?
It's a great question. I also am going to invite my colleagues to share, but it's not that the dismantling or it's the mental model of how it was demolished, right? It wasn't that because they demolished it, I felt my heritage was taken. I didn't have anything to do with that typology or architecture. It's that it was demolish to reinforce devaluing within a community, whereas in other places that are just 10 minutes away, like Bronxville, you have buildings that have been up since the founding of the town. And that's more of the gripe, that these architectural qualities would be preserved somewhere else. It's not that it's my heritage. And also, there's a concept that you should look up it's really helpful. It's called soulstalgia. And it's about how we connect, because it's our psychology, to space, and how understanding familiarity helps. It's a healing factor. So when you grow up with architecture that all of a sudden gets ripped out, they did all this study of what it psychologically does to people, because everything becomes unfamiliar and you become disconnected to what was something very connecting for you, a place of healing. So in many ways, it's just the manner or the representation, what it speaks in the act, rather than the act exclusively itself. On top of that, the Bronx is a really hard place for me to call home anymore, because the irony, as I mentioned in the presentation, in all of that, what looks after, like World War II, a bomb went off, we had such autonomy of someone policing us, or people always being on top of us, and it presents this quagmire, or this, like, it was moments of blissful freedom, because no one was there, and it just kind of like you had all of this amazing experiences without ever worrying if you were going to be killed by a police officer. People would play music, the congas and the drums, and it would be the depression, the decompression point, right? To have those block parties. That now, if you have a block party, you're harassed. It is trying to be erased, because either you end up dead, you end up in jail, or you end up scuffing with police. And then you have what's called the Karen effect now in places like the Bronx, where most of us like to blast our music, and it never was an issue, right? And all of a sudden now, I don't like that. But you weren't here for 3 generations. We were. So there's a lot of places where our stories still show up, and there's amazing efforts in the Bronx. But I don't think it's the same authentic story of when I grew up for me, because even hip hop has been so commercialized and commodified. It's not the hip hop I grew up in.
Interesting. I would like to tie up with something that Roberto mentioned, and I think both Coleman and April touched upon, and it's this movement, right? Like last year movement, I lived it. I was there, and I wondered, right? And this might be a little bit too dramatic, or maybe not tolerable to say, but nonetheless, my Dutch part moved me to ask you this. Do you think that it made people aware, definitely, of the system of a systematic racism in the country, of course? But do you think that it also made people aware that they are intolerant and there is an acceptance to that?
So who is the question for?
I don't know. I guess Coleman and April, because they are living in the United States, but in generally, globally, do you think that it's becoming also, like, there's been this movement, right? Black Lives Matter, we have to be more tolerant. Do you think that the country might be true too, that people might admit, I'm not tolerant, I'm not tolerating this, and it's quite okay?
Yeah, I think for myself, I think for the moment, I think it has made a lot of people a lot more aware in general, and not just. So we have these issues right now with the Asian community being attacked, and I think one thing that in my experience in living in the U.S. is, whatever minorities, with the Asians being having that label as the model minority. it's almost, I hate to say it, but it's almost like the systemic racism, the supremacy, has actually pitted other minorities against themselves in so many different ways that, we compete against each other. We have conflicts against each other. And we don't really, if you really look at the origins of it, it's really the origins of this country and the way supremacy has actually been built upon it. So I think one thing that I start to understand is that the other minorities, I think if they see the possibilities, the potential for like coming out of the shadows sometimes, where African Americans are never, we're not in the shadows ever. We're always there. But, during 9/11, all of a sudden, Muslim culture was threatened, and now the Asians. And so I think there's always a possibility for the other to be, shown and also stigmatized in some ways. So that's always, I think, going to happen in the U.S. until they resolve and start to look at Black Lives Matter, because other cultures have to begin, I think, to recognize the implications of what April had talked about eugenics. That scientific racism is a global issue. It's not just the U.S. It's global, and so I'm doing a paper on decolonization of Black aesthetic, and within a lot of the research, looking at the Arab culture, the Indian culture, the Korean, Japan, Brazil's, and other, all these cultures. The worst thing you can be in all of them is Black, and I think understanding that and understanding that is a point of departure for how we move forward. So yes, I do think there is some awareness, but as far as going the next step and not being complacent, just letting it go, that I don't quite believe myself it's going to happen right away. But I am glad to see some steps happening. Even in Italy, as I heard a conversation there about some of the Africans that have been there that were a part of the Black Lives Matter because of the way they have been treated at that time. And one thing I don't mean to go to, but one thing I was going to ask Roberto about in the context of Brazil. The U.S. has this concept of one drop Black and you're Black. Brazil, from my understanding, they got like 33 or so different categories of race, and it all stems from some different shades. And so, but the worst thing, it seems like still, the darker, the worse. So I'm just wondering if that stems across economically, but also through housing and the living conditions as well. So I don't mean to break that up, but I was just curious about that in the same context of understanding, okay, Black Lives Matter, but how does it relate in the built environment there as well?
Well, first of all, let me tell you that the Black Lives Matter movement was so important everywhere in the world, right? Yeah. It was like a fire in a dried forest. People were angry to see what's going on, not only in the United States, but in many places, right? Having said that, Brazil is a very weird country because we don't have that idea of the one drop at all. And therefore, I think people navigate through different identities a little bit differently than in the United States. Nevertheless, it's very racist, and you can see the distribution of people in the city where they live, for example, in slums, and our slums are appalling. Yeah, they are appalling. Most people living in slums are Black, or I don't know what's the correct way. They're mixed race most times in Brazil, but they are, and the whites generally live in middle class neighborhoods. So it's a really weird combination, because at this while we are not so concerned about classifying people, but the truth of the matter is that people are spatially segregated, very, very much. And that's yeah. and when I came to the Netherlands, what I saw was at least a welfare state that took care of everybody more or less equally. more or less equally. I have to say that here, Black families have access to very good housing. As Thijs was explaining, a lot of people live in social housing here. It's kind of very common. And but you know, there is segregation here as well, especially in schools, I would say. I hope I answered your question.
Actually, Roberto, I'm interested. Roberto and Thijs, what kind of segregation do you see in the Netherlands? Because it's really not the color of the skin. You know, those awkward questions of, you know, you enter a university, are you Black, white, Asian? There are none of such, right? So what kind of segregation, what is the social class? What is the social race that you believe is segregated, or is it just a mentality, like a wanting of like a different point of view?
I think what Roberto was saying, that is correct. It's on the line of education. So higher educated, also the way we call it, higher educated, lower educated. It's completely wrong. And it has been a lot of research recently came out that children like who have parents that are more practically educated or did not go to university have very often get an advice from their primary school, which is lower than you would have based on their actually the capabilities than people who have parents that are higher educated. And obviously that also involves race, because I think the populations that have a different background, whether they come from Turkey, Morocco, or any other place in the world, they very often are educated more in a practical way. I mean, we invited them to come here to, you know, as labor basically, and yeah, so that's very. So those children they have less opportunity to higher education because they get a lower advice than, and that's very problematic. So I think education here is the big separation, the education system basically. Also because we give kids an advice for the rest of their life at the age of 11. So, you know, I heard the alderman of Amsterdam's, the education alderman saying, you know, on television in a documentary series last year, saying like our education system is still this is like a century old. It's based on the fact that we're a farmer society. So children should become productive as soon as possible. And whether that's with their minds or with their hands, that doesn't really matter, but they should become productive as soon as possible. So from the age of 11, we give them an advice that kind of that has an impact on the rest of their life. And I think there's not a single education expert that thinks that's a very good idea. And so I think there's a clear separation. And last thing I want to say about it is that, and if you then see who's being represented, for instance, in Parliament, then out of the 150 members of Parliament, most of them are actually higher educated. So who's representing the lower educated people? I think that's a very important question.
To this, I will say we can close this webinar and thank really much all the panelists that have been participating to this. Really thank you for your wisdom. And I really hope that there are a lot of students in this webinar. I really hope that we can make a difference with our design, slowly but surely. So all panelists, not myself included, please put yourself on mute. I have some housekeeping before we close. Thank you everybody for attending this lecture, and we really hope that the significant message and encouragement of this talk will make us really design better places for people. Please note that the recording has been, like all the other recordings earlier, has been saved in the Baltimore-Rotterdam Committee YouTube channel and will be available very soon. Once it's uploaded, all the participants will be receiving an email communicating this event. Once again, April, virtually. Thijs, Roberto, Coleman, Rachel, Jeremiah, and everybody else's. Thank you for attending and participating. And we hope to launch new and very exciting webinars soon. Bye. Good night or good afternoon.